Thank you so much to the UC system for hosting this today. I'm Sarah Bone. I'm with the Public Policy Institute of California. We are a nonpartisan research organization with a mission to inform and improve public policy through rigorous research. And I'm delighted to now be directing our new research center focused on economic policy. And with me today, we have Carolyn Chu, who's the Chief Deputy of the Legislative Analyst's Office. For those of you who weren't here this morning to hear Gabe, just want to make sure that you know that the LAO is a nonpartisan fiscal and policy branch for the legislature. And Carolyn works on just a couple small issues like the state economy, the budget condition, health and human services, and many others. Chris Woods is the budget director for the California State Senate and is the top budget advisor to Senate Leader Mike McGuire and a proud UC Davis graduate, I understand. We have lots of UC representation on this panel. Kilhu, did I pronounce it? Ha, I'm so sorry. I meant to ask you beforehand. Kilha is Senior Vice President at Pew Charitable Trust, where he heads their Government Performance Division, seeking to strengthen effectiveness of government at the federal, state, and local levels. So I know we have lots to ask you about for advice on. Kil has been there since 2007, leading fiscal and economic policy projects. And last but not least is Robin Cox, another UC representative, professor at UC Riverside in the Public Policy School, and a faculty affiliate at the Presley Center for Crime and Justice. Her research expertise is centered at the intersection of criminal legal system and inequality, and is concerned with understanding systemic barriers that communities, especially Black communities, face. So really look forward to hearing your perspective today. So our panel topic is, the theme of our session is on transitions, which is totally apt because California's economic history is one of many transitions. And we will do our best to decode, as the agenda says, what's going on and what's before us before coding becomes obsolete, given one of the transitions that we might get to today in technology. We only have an hour and a half, and we have lots of big transitions, in my view, that California's economy is in the midst of or will be soon. So I hope that this will be an ongoing conversation. And for my part, as a representative of PPIC here today, we're really happy to be here today and also anxious to be part of the ongoing conversation, bringing research as we can to the conversation that hopefully will involve a broad range of stakeholders, legislatures, and Californians. Just to set a little bit of the ground for us, in a PPIC statewide survey, we find that 70% of Californians believe that the state's children will be worse off financially than their parents when they reach adulthood. That's a statistic that's gotten a bit worse over time and motivates a lot of our work, frankly, about thinking of California's future, and especially our economic future. And I would suggest that we do have very strong economic headwinds in front of us, from the high cost of living in the state to a labor market reshaped by remote work and the pandemic, from an aging population that's making it harder for the state to grow and meet its economic needs, from big entrenched divides in economic outcomes across groups, from new challenges ahead like technology and climate risks. None of these are transitions that have easy solutions. So again, hope to be part of this ongoing conversation, because we do believe at PPIC that even though these are really hard challenges, that the choices that we make today and the policy that we put in place can shape an economic future for Californians that is more robust, that provides greater prospects for the state's workers, its businesses, its communities, and all of its people. So I won't take up any more time because I want to learn from our panelists here today. And I'm going to start with a question for each of you to answer that is just in a big picture, kind of where we're at and how we got here, so that we can kind of learn more about each of your unique perspectives. So looking back, what would you say, in your experience and expertise, are some of the key events and factors that have shaped the economic landscape of California where we are today, especially with some of the challenges at hand? Do you want to start, Carolyn?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, turn it off. Okay, sure. So I think California and perhaps Chris's focus as well will be maybe more budget oriented in terms of how the California economy impacts the state budget. And California benefited significantly pre-pandemic and through the pandemic from federal policies that made sort of the cost of money very low, right? Interest rates were zero or negative. That enabled significant investment in startup companies within California in different types of industries, and really buoyed the state's revenue growth through that period. And in the pandemic, the federal government really put the gas pedal down to the floor to try to ensure that the national economy didn't fall off a cliff with the onset of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders. And we saw huge gains in asset prices and in the market more broadly. Higher-end folks made significant amounts of money, which buoyed the state's revenues very significantly. And also we, as you all know, experienced a period of very rapid growth in inflation, and has somewhat leveled off now. But the consequence of that is that the Federal Reserve has taken action to try to tamp down that growth in inflation and slow it down. And that has some less positive consequences for California in terms of the appeal of the investing in some businesses that have kind of epicenters in California, particularly startup companies, and that can and that, as we see in kind of the state's budget, has some negative consequences in terms of the revenue growth and kind of leveling off from that period of significant expansion. So maybe that's how I'd kick things off and turn it over to you, Chris.
Yeah, I think the events that are shaping us today are really, nobody can not acknowledge that the pandemic was still a significant issue with dealing today. And a lot of it has to do with the reaction to the pandemic, which was very strong and good. We did not go over a cliff when we shut the entire economy down. The federal government deserves a lot of credit for that, of keeping things going and keeping money flowing to people that were out of work and different things. So kept things going. That was great. The reaction to that is still lives with us today in many ways. And then from the budget perspective, that is somewhat reflective of a lot of that, we had a really robust emergence from the pandemic. And it turns out our emergence and the robustness wasn't quite as big as we thought. And we're dealing with some of the consequences of that. But I think overall, the fundamentals of California remain very strong. The real trick for us going forward on everything needs to be the cost of living in California. And the cost of housing ultimately is the main driver on that.
Great. I think just like my two other panelists, the pandemic was really state shaping in a lot of ways, but I would bring our attention back to the Great Recession, because I really think that was an inflection point that we shouldn't lose sight of. If you think about just the conditions during the Great Recession in terms of the housing crisis, but also the just broader financial crisis, it really shaped a lot of factors that we're dealing with now that the pandemic actually exacerbated. So if you think about low fertility rates, that really started to exponentially get a little bit more challenging during the Great Recession. People just decided to hold off on having children, and even decided maybe over the long run not to even decide to have kids. The pandemic made that a little bit more challenging and potentially delayed childbirths even more. I would also argue that on the housing front, the Great Recession fundamentally reshaped how the housing market functioned in terms of production and financing. And that trend just got a little bit more challenging during the pandemic. And the cost of building also and construction just actually got a little bit more challenging, which was already sort of carrying forth with a trend that started during the Great Recession. In addition to that, I would say on the bright side, some of the fiscal measures that the California and other states took as a result of the Great Recession are what helped it actually get through the pandemic in a far more effective way. One of the things I'm a little worried about is just the challenge that California is experiencing right now. Again, is this noise that we see or like a long-term signal? That's kind of still to be determined. But some of the fiscal tools that it developed are being utilized right now. And the challenge is that if things should get more problematic, should we actually experience a recession somewhat in the near term, it's going to limit the tools that it has to manage through that. And that's the challenge that I'm thinking about a lot.
Thanks, and I'm so happy you mentioned the Great Recession because it segues perfectly into what I want to talk about in terms of inequality, because we know that not all groups rebounded in the same way from the Great Recession, and in particular, marginalized communities have yet to rebound to their same levels when we look at wealth levels that was eroded during the Great Recession. And so things like the Great Recession and COVID-19, really what they do is for these communities really make things sort of evident and kind of compounded and worse, although the issues have been there historically. And so one of the things that I think would be hugely important is to sort of address these historical and systemic barriers that have been present for many, many years, that California has had present for many, many years. My family's been here for a very long time. And these are really entrenched, and it's going to take really nuanced policy. It's going to take a really nuanced approach to policy because some of the approaches may not be politically feasible. I think California has started when it comes to thinking about how to restore some and repair some of the harm that has been done with some of these groups. I'm thinking about the reparations committee that was established. But really, I think that if we want to look at this from an equity lens, because all of these things are great if we talk about averages, it may help certain groups, but I think we won't really see what's happening to the most disadvantaged groups if we don't take a look separately at these groups, and that really requires an equity lens. So that's what I think. California seems to have started that, but definitely more to do with that as well.
Definitely, and I want to get back to that and dig in a little bit further. But first, I want to return to the budget theme that has been occurring throughout the day. We know this is the biggest issue in Sacramento right now, and one of the major transitions on theme of this panel is going from a really robust budget situation to a limited one. So I'm going to start with Chris and Carolyn to just dig in a little bit more and hear your perspective on the depth of the fiscal challenge today, what tactics or measures, in your experience dealing with the ups and downs of the budget over the years, what has been effective at mitigating budget crises in the past, and what do you see as the most promising strategies, for sustainability going forward? Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we're in a serious budget challenge right now, and we need to address it. And I think we do have more tools available to us. And one of the things we've learned, not only from the Great Recession, but for the decade plus that led up to the Great Recession, where California really was just bouncing from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis, and the economy would rebound. We'd be fine from the economic perspective, but we were in a annual, perpetual budget challenge every year. We didn't have a single year when the LAO's multi-year November forecast, they never had back-to-back years that showed California had a balanced, structurally balanced budget. And so we went from that kind of decade plus dysfunction, ending with the Great Recession, and we emerged out of that saying we've got to get our act together. And so we did a lot of really good things in the time since. And the biggest thing we did is we created the Real Rainy Day Fund, and that was our just common sense approach to things. Well, you ought to build up reserves in good times to spend in the bad times, but it's also a really important tool to deal with our revenue volatility. That's what you hear people talk about all the time, especially our very well-informed columnists over and over again will write about how revenue volatility is the big problem in California, and somehow we need to reform our tax system to have stable revenues to do that. And they never really tell you what they're saying, and that is what they want to do is cut taxes on the rich and raise taxes on everybody else. Now, we don't think that makes sense economically, and it doesn't make sense politically, so it's really not going to happen. And so our approach instead was, well, let's just be smart, and let's take spiking money during the good times and move it to have it available during bad times. And that's sort of an economically efficient way of stabilizing our revenues. And our little cliche is volatile revenues are only a problem if it leads to volatile spending. So let's just not lead to volatile spending. Let's get spending off of this ups and downs, but let's actually take advantage of our volatile revenues. So that's good, and it's a good start, but turns out we need to do more of that. And so that's one of the things we'll do now is to look ahead and how can we build up our reserves more, dealing with the problem we just had of surplus being projected as being, over $100 billion surplus. And then the Constitution telling us under the GAN limit, and I'm not going to bore you with the details of that, but the Constitution essentially tells us you have to allocate all your money. You can't put money in the reserve after a certain extent, and that doesn't make any sense. And so we need to fix that to make sure we can actually build our reserves. And then next time we have a big projected surplus, we need to not allocate that money to everything. We need to put it aside and have it be available later on if it turns out the money comes in. So our budget's based on projections. You get a projection, and then the Constitution says allocate every nickel in that projection, and then it turns out that projection was off. Now we're in trouble, and that's what we're dealing with now. We're actually, I think, still ahead on the revenue side of what our projections were prior to that on an annual basis. So it's not like we went over a cliff. It's just we didn't go as high as we thought, and now we spent all the money. So now what are we going to do about it? That's the challenge, and it's a serious challenge, and it's not going to be easy, but doesn't have to be devastating either if we're smart about it.
Just to tee off what Chris was saying, there is a significant budget problem this year, but the legislature does have a lot of tools to deal with it, in large part because the vast majority of the significant surpluses in recent years were dedicated to one-time purposes, one-time and temporary purposes. And that is important because it was conveyed as a kind of cushion to weather the potential that the revenues would not come in as strong as forecasted, right? When the legislature is enacting a budget, they are enacting a budget that is predicated on anticipated revenues for the forthcoming year. The budget is not based on we collected X last year so we can spend Y this year. It is we anticipate X and so we will spend Y. And so the legislature has a significant amount of flexibility to pull back that one-time spending without disrupting kind of ongoing programmatic expectations. Now, that's not to say that reducing those one-time expenditures doesn't come at a cost or doesn't mean that projects won't be pursued or needs aren't met, but it is not disrupting kind of that ongoing level of service. And when our office looks at the budget condition, what we're really trying to gauge is the extent to which the ongoing or what we call like core service level of the state is sustainable. And that's something that we try to assess through our multi-year forecast that we do in November, and we'll do another one in May based on what the administration proposes for their amended budget. Just see what might you expect if you enacted this budget this year. Will it be balanced? In the last year, we released our forecast a bit late because of the delay in the IRS filings. And we were predicting a structural deficit going forward after this budget year. And the administration, their estimates released in January also reflected a structural deficit. Now, as Chris said, the revenues are volatile. So likely that deficit estimate is going to change when we do our updated estimate. But what does it look like? And what does that mean about kind of the core programmatic service levels that the state can support?
How concerned are you, just quick follow-up on, if there is that structural deficit, the tools that we have that, have helped us so far, we're going to just need to think of new ones?
Well, I think, our guidance to the legislature this year has been trying to put colloquially to help your future selves. So pulling back on the one-time money is a use or lose solution. If you don't pull back that one-time money, it will go out the door this year, and you'll have to rely on reserves or a different type of solution this year that then won't be available next year. So how can you best prepare for the possibility that we face structural deficits by keeping your more flexible budget tools like reserves and internal borrowing set aside. And the administration and under I think the legislature's plan only uses about half of the state's reserves to address the upcoming budget problem. And using reserves, given the scope of the budget problem at this juncture, at least as we know it in January, all the numbers will change, by the way. You can throw all the numbers from the last 4 months out of your head. They will all change in May. That's very reasonable to use some of the reserves given the size of the deficit. But as I said, their plan is to only use half, which is quite prudent. There does need to be some left for the future.
Yeah, and I just to reiterate, it does give us a modest amount of heartburn to use the reserves now, given that we aren't in a national recession. And when we created that rainy day fund, it was sort of envisioned to help weather a recession type situation. Interestingly, though, the LAO will tell us if California were a nation, we probably would have been looked like we had dipped into a recession about a year ago. And so I do think the grand scheme of things, it's okay that we are using that. It's good that we're limiting it to just half, but it gives us a little bit of pause. Maybe you were alluding to that earlier, because we could get through this, and we will, but then maybe we have a national recession or something, and all of a sudden a lot of our tools are depleted. So we are very concerned about that, but in the grand scheme of things, we did probably hit a recession last year. Makes sense to dip into our reserves somewhat to help mitigate things.
Kil, I'd like to bring you in now. You already alluded to this in your kind of opening comments, but I'd like to hear more about your perspectives from, maybe what other states do or what is kind of prudent, best government that you find in your work at Pew, that can further ensure fiscal responsibility in California.
Yeah. First, I'd like to just agree with Chris that I don't think that revenue volatility is inherently a bad thing. I think the state has done a very effective job of harnessing that volatility, and the tool that Chris and Carolyn referred to, the rainy day fund, is the mechanism by which they're harnessing the volatility in good years so that it can be there for when trouble strikes. And to the point that Carolyn and Chris made, you should be using it in times of downturn, right? And or shortfalls as California is currently experiencing. I think the question is what can it do to improve and enhance that tool going forward? And that's something that from my perspective at Pew, some other states are thinking about their rainy day funds from more of a risk-based perspective as opposed to putting a hard cap on the deposits that are going into the rainy day fund. California also has some really interesting structural features like the Gantt limits that causes certain decisions to be framed in particular ways. What goes into the rainy day fund is part of that Gantt limit, and maybe the state leaders could think of ways of exempting that, because that is really intended not to be spending, but as a cushion for future downturns. Those are two things that come to mind. But I think, as Carolyn was saying, the state is extremely sophisticated in thinking of ongoing spending versus temporary one-time spending, and the fact that it did such a good job of differentiating and using one-time money for temporary purposes is really to be lauded. A lot of states I think finally realized that they couldn't be spending one-time funds on recurring expenses because that's just going to cause further challenges down the road. I will say, though, that I worry less about annual deficits and more about structural deficits. And California is at least facing, by LAO's own estimates, about a $30 billion ongoing structural deficit. And that's just concerning because essentially, it is spending right now more than it is bringing in. And that's something that potentially the volatility could help with in good years, but it depends on how that situation gets managed. And that's something that we're watching closely.
Thanks, Kil. And Robin, your work centers on economic inequality, and that is a feature, unfortunately, of California's economy for a long time, a prominent feature, I would say. So I'd love to get your perspective on, in the budget reality that we're dealing with today, against the structural kind of long-term divides that you highlighted earlier. What do you think are the most important maybe policy or kind of budget areas that can start to address some of those disparities that you study?
Yeah. So I think the disparities are multifaceted, right? Um, we can think about income inequality. We can think about wealth disparities. Um, some would argue that wealth disparities are sort of capture the compounding of the issues that have taken place and the um, barriers to entry um, into inclusion, economic inclusion that has happened over the years. Um, but it's going to take a multifaceted approach, right, to address these barriers. Um, if you look at some of the most recent economic research, it suggests that in order to address, for example, racial wealth gaps, reparations are the only sort of tool that really immediately addresses it, but it's not enough because you have to also address the differences in asset portfolios. You have to address the differences. You have to address income inequality, which feeds into the wealth gap. Differences in savings. All of those things also have to be addressed to maintain that closure, right? And so these would suggest, like when you think about over the years, there's been a lot of things that have happened over the years since the 1970s, right? We've seen increases in mass incarceration policies have happened. We've had increases in inequality, increase in income and wealth inequality that have coincided with that as well. And so all of that has sort of led us to this point here. And so really we need policies that address inequalities in the labor market, barriers in the labor market. We need policies that address barriers in housing, policies that address the racial wealth gap, which much of it is historical. It starts from a historical place and the historical differences, which, I mean, if you look at 1860 was 60-1, white to black wealth gap. Policies that address differences in savings rate, and all of these things are interconnected, right? And so there are some there, as everyone's mentioned, that these things cost money as well, right? And so that's part of the issue where when you need targeted policies to disenfranchised groups is how do you fund those policies that we know are needed? Californians do believe that the inequality that we see is connected to racial biases and racial inequality, right? According to the surveys that have been done. It's a challenge. There are some market-based strategies. I've done some work on employee ownership. Employee ownership can kill two birds with one stone. It doesn't address the historical difference in wealth that drives much of the difference that we see here today in racial wealth disparities, but in terms of making some of these other flow variables like income and savings rates and capital gains more equitable, there may be a role for something like employee ownership, where, for example, ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. If a company converts to an ESOP, oftentimes what happens is the workers will, if it's a leveraged ESOP, they'll take out a loan to purchase the company from the owner, and then as that loan is paid back, shares are distributed to the employees, so they're employee owners. And so oftentimes this is done without requiring the employees to actually use their own money to invest, as in a traditional sort of 401k, to invest in the company. And so that frees up for individuals who may not have the freedom to the who may be restricted economically and in terms of their income to invest in sort of these assets, that actually like provides an asset to those individuals, and they can then, that frees up their income to be used for their everyday needs and living expenses, right? It also helps them to save and allows them to, it operates like a traditional retirement defined contribution plan. If they leave the company will purchase the stock back from them. They're not publicly available stocks though. So something like that, and these companies have been found to actually offer higher income to their employees, as well as not only wage benefits, but also non-wage benefits or non-wage compensation, like childcare subsidies and additional 401k programs and education, benefits towards education, which is also hugely important, as you know, in this economy, because much of what has driven the inequality, at least amongst the bottom 99%, has been this sort of skill divide, right? And returns to skills, high skill labor increasing relative to low skill labor, and then the sort of the erosion of that middle income. So that's one example of sort of a market-based approach. There's other approaches that are needed that will involve, policies, because part of what got us into this mess are policies, are protectionist policies that favored certain groups above others. And so we have to start thinking about the policies that were put in place to restrict home ownership, to restrict access to the labor market. How do we address and undo the cost to those policies as well? So it's also going to take a policy approach as well, which is a little bit more tricky because we have to deal with political feasibility.
To jump on that, I mean, we do have one policy, and it is so multifaceted, right? And one idea that we've been working on now for 2 years under Pro Tem Tony Atkins was the California Dream for All program, and that is basically a shared equity program to make home ownership more of a reality. And right now it's kind of targeted to only first generation home buyers. So, but our kind of view of it, right, is that the first step to generational wealth is owning a home. And there's been no example of just overt racism than the barriers to home ownership over the decades. So this is a kind of a one attack to all of that, is to make home ownership more of a reality, focusing on first generation. So if you didn't grow up in a home owning family, you're able to get in the program. Hopefully it'll make it even broader as the years go by. And the great thing is, unlike, like you say, so many of the things would actually require money and spending money, the program actually makes money off of this because it is this shared equity approach. And so the money can get recycled through, and it isn't just money going out of the budget every year. And so those are some great ideas you just mentioned. And just to piggyback on that is the shared appreciation home ownership program, which we hope to expand and open up to allow other people to really participate in this state-run program to make home ownership more affordable, lower the price by over 1/3 of your monthly mortgage, and get people into being homeowners, and first step of generational wealth.
Can I throw in another
Please.
market-based solution? Zoning reform. Right now, overly restrictive land use policies really only, not only, but really put a thumb on the scale for a certain type of home, house, right? Single family dwellings, largely detached. And it's not really using the land or providing opportunities for a large spectrum of individuals and families. And zoning, again, it doesn't require a financial investment. It really is about letting the markets work a little bit more effectively. And if you pair like zoning reform with maybe some expedited permitting, and then, with public dollars, you can use and leverage those mechanisms to actually create more supply, more opportunities. Where you live has a lot to do with how you access a bundle of services, whether it be education, jobs, or even recreational activities. And so that's something to think about as well, too.
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, and just to make the connection, zoning policies often were passed in order to segregate communities, right? So there's a connection here between this equity issue and some of the issues that we're dealing with today, like homelessness. I also want to mention that I don't want to make it seem as though we should not also invest public dollars to address some of these harms that have happened, because we for sure definitely need to. But that's going to take more nuanced effort, and it's actually going to take better education, I think, of the public to understand how historically these inequalities are entrenched and how it has persisted to this day. And that, we live in a technocratic society, and we kind of think that, the way we are now is because of some feature of the person that has created the situation that they're in today, right? Or some feature of a group, when in fact there's historical policies, there's historical actions, deliberate actions to exclude some groups from full social participation. And so you do need that reparative approach as well. But there's other approaches that may be more immediate as we're working on this sort of reparative approach.
Thank you for that, Robin. I'm going to have us shift gears a little bit to a different transition that will affect our economy and that has come up throughout the day, and that is the state's demography. Earlier, we were talking about the decline in the state's population. The aging of the population has been referred to. So I want to get some perspectives on that, how the demographic shifts are affecting economic policy choices. And I just have to say, I'm often a little jealous of demographers because some of the demographic change is pretty predictable compared to what's going on in the economy. So just had to put that out there. Nonetheless, how the state's people are changing, where they're living, where they're moving, if they're coming or not, how they're rapidly they're aging, will kind of affect the state's economy. So I'd like to kind of hear perspectives from this panel on, how you see California's population and demographic change that is amidst us already affecting the state's economy or economic policy choices that you deal with in your work. What are kind of the most important economic policy issues that we should be paying attention to deal with this transition that's happening in California?
Well, I guess I can kick it off. The two things come to mind for me. First, the one, as you mentioned, Sarah, that has been long known and is upon us is just the aging of California's population, and increasingly the older workers starting to retire, and the extent to which COVID-19 may have precipitated folks exiting the labor market, and what that kind of means for the labor force overall in California. I think we don't quite know how that's all going to shake out, but with each passing year, additional folks are going to opt to retire and move out of the labor force, and California will face a number of choices about how to kind of deal with that as an economy and as a state. The state itself has what's called the Master Plan for Aging, so a very deliberative approach to try to prepare state programs for delivering services to an aging population and ensuring folks can kind of get the care that they need. California has a relative, and Kayla may know better than I do on this topic, but a relatively robust set of services for the aging population, especially those that have fewer assets and income to help them stay in their homes. The other thing that's been somewhat debated, or I should say it has been hotly debated recently, is some of the population losses California has experienced since the pandemic, and whether or not that is a trend that we will see continue to occur, or if that's a trend that was kind of a more of a one-time or temporary effect of the significant work flexibilities that folks were granted during the pandemic. So, as folks may be aware, before the pandemic, California typically had outmigration of lower income individuals with less educational attainment, but had a significant inflow of folks with higher educational attainment, as well as international migration into California that kind of maintained its workforce population. During the pandemic, we saw the outflow of a significant number of higher income folks and that has been discussed as an issue as to whether or not it's affecting the state budget. It is, but not significantly. We did some estimates around the outflows in 2021 and estimated that it reduced state revenues by maybe 1%. But that was, again, in a year with huge surpluses. So it really was a situation where the surpluses would have been even larger had that not occurred. Now we await the IRS data for 2022, which should be coming out in the next couple of days here to see if the trend is continuing or not. But it's another thing for California certainly to keep its eye on.
Yeah, I think that is the most interesting thing for decades you've been hearing people are fleeing, everyone's moving to Incline Village in Nevada because of our tax rates and things, and that was never the case. And now with the pandemic era, we have for the first time, okay, now maybe some upper income, a lot of employees, just higher paid employees that could work remotely and do different things, we're maybe moving out, and we'll see if it sticks or not. The other thing is a lot of moving inland. So here in Sacramento, we see a lot of folks moving from the coast here. I think Modesto had the highest homeowner, cost of home values in the state, I think at 31% or something in the last year or something. So the Central Valley, Sacramento Valley, seeing a big influx of folks coming in, and often, well-paid people coming in, and that's generally good, but we got to make sure we don't deal with any of the negative consequences of that happening either in our kind of local communities as well.
Yeah, for me, just in looking at the data, I'm still struggling to figure out, as I said in the beginning, what's noise and what's a long-term signal. And I think, we just heard about people moving out, whether or not that's temporary or is a long-term trend that sticks. That's still something that I really haven't been able to parse out. What I can tell you, though, is what's interesting about California is that it's always dealt with these macro trends differently, right? I mean, population growth started to slow in the 1960s, so that's a long time ago. It's just that California always outperformed the national trend. When you look at the sort of median growth rates in California, they were always 4 times higher than that of the 50-state median. That was, back in the 50s and the 60s. But if you look at a more recent decade, from 2010 to 2020, it's right at the 50-state median. So it used to float in a different orbit. It's now in the same orbit as the rest of the 50 states, and that's something that's a little concerning. So will these macro trends hit California in the same way that it's hit a lot of other states? That's the question that I'm grappling with, because what you see in the future is not great, right? Fertility rates are low. We don't have replacement population nationally. In addition to that, more than 1 in 5 residents of the United States will be over 65 by 2030. When you look out to 2035, the population over 85 is going to double. So, right now it's sitting roughly about under 6 million. It's going to be over 12 million by 2035. And this is just demographic trends, right? Sarah said the nice thing about demography is that you can tell, year by year, people are getting older, and that's exactly what's happening, and that's the concern. But one of the things that's also interesting about California is that while people are leaving, people are getting older, it's also the 11th youngest state in the nation, right? And that bodes well in terms of prime age employment, down the road. So it's gonna have workers to fill these jobs that maybe other states don't, because of an aging population, because of low birth rates and things of that nature. And so that's something that's a silver lining, but how it plays out is something that I'm still wondering about.
This is a bit of a wild card, Kill, but since you're our DC representative on the panel, I'm thinking about immigration. It hasn't been mentioned yet, but immigrants to California is what has kept our population growing over, I think, the past 2 decades. And there's a wild card, or also just a little bit less predictable, right, given, federal policy decisions. I don't know, can you comment on that, or how much should we be concerned about the draw of California for immigrants, or how that will affect our economy?
I mean, if you just look at the recent trend data, California still is a destination for foreign migration. I think it's one of the leading states when it comes to foreign migration. And so, it is a place where, given the diversity of its economy and the strength of its past performance, people are drawn to. Plus, culturally, it's rich, it's very diverse. And so it remains a destination for foreign migration. What's happening at the national level, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I really don't know what we're going to do on immigration. That is a big piece of the puzzle in terms of how the U.S. replaces its population, but because it's not going to happen through natural birth rates, right? That hasn't been the trend in a long time. Immigration, as Sarah said, has really what's kept us afloat. And if you potentially take that off the table, I think it's a big question mark for us.
Robin, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I just want to say a few things. One is that I think my fellow panelists also mentioned the aging population. And so just linking it back to sort of employee ownership, that might actually offer an opportunity if we think about succession planning for entrepreneurs or people who own their own businesses. Can we encourage those individuals to transfer ownership to their employees, right? So that's so as we're thinking about demographic changes and sort of the aging population, that's one way to think about something that could happen or something good that could happen out of these demographic shifts. Another one on a more negative note would be who are the people who are leaving? We've talked about it's lower income individuals. Those are disproportionately marginalized groups. And so are we losing some forms of untapped human capital with that? And diversity and all of the benefits that can bring with that's a result of the high cost of living in California that's leading some of these groups to pursue locations that are more affordable.
Thank you. And I think what might be the last kind of theme of transition that we'll be able to cover before Q&A, I want to switch to technology. It's been kind of brought in, I think Robin brought it in as one of the drivers of the inequality that we've seen and something that has shaped California's economy. Of course, we're known as, I think, the innovator in the world, and I expect we still will be, but there's a lot of uncertainty about the technological change that's amidst us with AI and further automation. So I'm hoping the panel can jump in and comment on, your perspectives around how you think about California's economic future and policymaking in this kind of uncertain environment of technology and its adoption. What are your priorities for kind of policy areas to pay attention to, or maybe what we can learn from past technological transformations that the state has been through over the, I'd say, last 40, 50 years?
I could take a crack at this.
Please.
I think when you think about the assets of California, it's almost too many to enumerate when it comes from the innovation side, right? When you think about the world-class universities, Silicon Valley, when you think about the defense industry in Southern California, the innovation that's happening in the health sciences field, California has always managed to innovate its way out of any economic doldrums that it's had, and you can expect the same, because if you're talking about advances in immunotherapy, even a defense-led economy, as the gentleman from Anderson Center was talking about this morning. You think about some of the presence of national labs here in California, it's going to be in the mix. And so, I think that those are positives that the state has going for it. The other thing that's happening, which could be an interesting phenomenon, is it has a diversity of workers. It has the ability to potentially pull people off the sidelines, I think, under the right conditions. And one of the things that I've been looking at a lot is the CHIPS Act from the Biden administration. And what's interesting about this is it's not just a way of increasing chip manufacturing in the United States. It's not a national defense, national security program. It's also an economic development program. A couple of the features that the CHIPS Act has that are not really talked about that much are the requirements on childcare, the affordable housing plan that's required in order to access some of the incentives and grant funding, in addition to the childcare provisions, because it's really trying to upskill, bring women back into the workforce, and do so in a way that is a little bit different. It's not through wages necessarily. It's through training, and it's through providing support networks that wouldn't otherwise be there, that's sometimes holding people back from fully participating in the labor market. And so that's an interesting thing to watch, and that's potentially something that if California can learn a lesson from this national experiment that's going on, could be beneficial.
I'll take maybe a narrow response. I think obviously what wasn't directly mentioned but is on a lot of people's minds is sort of what role AI is going to play for the state economy, the labor force, everything else. The state is embarking on a few different types of pilot programs within certain departments to try to use AI to improve service delivery within the state, which I think, potentially fraught, but also potentially very beneficial in terms of expanding access to different populations and reaching populations that may not currently benefit from state programs. And so I think there's going to be a lot to watch in terms of how the state attempts to roll out tools that facilitate greater service delivery just in terms of total volume, but also meaning that other populations that don't currently benefit from state programs might be able to, either because of language access barriers or other types of barriers, as well as potentially make some types of state services more efficient as well. So I think there are certainly potential benefits kind of to the state service ecosystem and how that affects the California economy. I think the fruition of those benefits will be very long in terms of how long it will see to roll out and see what benefits they may ultimately yield. But it is, I think, an exciting area for kind of state policy to really grapple with. And there are, as I'm sure you're all aware, tons and tons of bills in the legislature about how to kind of grapple with some of these questions.
I heard it was the year of AI in the state legislature, but there's a lot of other priorities on the table. You want to jump in, Rob?
Yeah, and that's perfect segue to what I wanted to say in terms of technology is that it can be a double-edged sword. And so one of the things is we're thinking about policies and implementing technology and how it can help us to reach hard-to-reach populations and how it can improve efficiency and that sort of thing. We also want to think about, and keep in mind the fact that AI is using algorithms that could also bake in some of the biases that we see in society, and so we can't just take it from a face value, take it on its face value. We have to consciously implement AI and the policies that to encourage AI. We need to also keep that in mind as we're thinking about those policies as well, because we don't want to worsen disparities because we're ignoring like lots of the research that's out there that talks about how these algorithms can be very biased, right?
Thank you, Robin. Chris, do you want to jump in?
Just add, we just can't be scared of technology. We need to go and then be prepared to deal with the people that get left behind as labor things change, and make sure where there's a safety net or ways to retrain or get people to keep going. So we need to just keep our eye on that. We also, as looking forward, we also need to make sure our existing technologies are available to everybody, and we need to make sure wherever you live in the state, you have the same access to high-speed internet and the basic things you need to do a job or to go to school and to learn or to talk to a doctor and those things. So while we look to the future, we also need to make sure we're doing a pretty good job with the technology we have today.
Yeah, I agree, and it's an area for which we can see some of that retraining. We've seen a huge erosion of middle-income jobs, and so it's an area where we might be able to see some of the retraining that's necessary to get folks back into some of these better high-quality jobs as well. So, it provides potential opportunity as well, and so we just want to make sure that that we provide access to all groups for that, right? And provide access to education that's needed to enter into these sectors.
Thank you, Robin. Okay, I think in our last 5 minutes before we go to Q&A, so please get your questions ready. I want to do a quick round because we have this very cool mix of people on the panel, and you know, as I alluded to at the beginning, this is all hard stuff that will require ongoing conversation and data and research. I'd like to hear from each of you on how you think collaboration between decision makers in the Capitol, between researchers in academia, or in organizations like Pew or PPIC, as well as with communities and other stakeholders in the policy process, how can that be enhanced to create deeper understanding, to provide the information that's needed to make the best decisions for California's economic future? What more could we be doing, or how could we be doing things better?
Well, I mean, hopefully there's good communication as we go. And I know from our perspective, as we kind of look at figuring out approaches to dealing with budget issues and things, you know, we rely very heavily on the Legislative Analyst Office, and I know they integrate a lot of the good thinking from around the country into their work. So hopefully there's a lot of that already. And then our basic budget process is a pretty open process of, you know, public hearings, and we need the public to participate as much as possible. And so, you know, over 100 different budget committee hearings every year. Sorry, it is a pretty open and collaborative process as we go through. And so I just encourage people to participate in those things. And whether you participate in person or not, based on thanks to our technology, everything is online, available online, and go back and look at those past hearings as well. So, yeah, so that's sort of my rapid answer. The more collaboration, the better. We certainly don't have all the answers ourselves, and the more good ideas out there, and diversity of thought too. We can't all just have the same sort of, you know, same sort of echo chamber of thought going on either. So that's the broader input from folks, the better.
I would just dovetail off of Chris's comments for our own office. You know, the budget process is extremely truncated. We have maybe 6 weeks to kind of shake out the good, bad, and the ugly of what we think the administration is putting forward, testify before the legislature to try to get our points across to them, and then we do it all over again in a very high sprint effort in May to the final budget package. To the extent, you know, what we call our kind of quieter season, when it's not actually really quiet at all, is the summer and fall, when we really try to reach out to researchers, stakeholders, other parties to kind of get their input, their perspective, their research, their knowledge that then builds on our own analysis that we're using in then that subsequent budget period. So, you know, very much we try to reach out as much as we can in the thick of the budget season to the folks who have on the ground knowledge or are doing the research more directly, but it is more truncated. So to the extent anyone out there listening is thinking about when is the best time to reach out to the LAO, it's, you know, often in the summer and fall, and we really value and appreciate those opportunities to interact.
Cool. I know DC relies a lot on Pew. So what lessons do you have for us here?
I mean, we do work a lot at the federal level, but we also do a lot of work across the 50 states. And one of the things that I have found to be very valuable is just the opportunity to bring people together. As Carolyn was saying, you know, states are looking to learn from each other all the time. There are diversity of perspectives and approaches out there. You know, folks from Oregon, for example, are learning about statewide zoning reform from, and Oregon was the leading state in this regard, but they're learning a lot from Montana and the efforts that Governor Gianforte has been putting in place to actually improve zoning and land use regulations in his state to increase production. And so those kind of connections are invaluable. And the more you can create conditions where people are hearing from each other, and just learning, I think, would be great. And that's a great role for, you know, systems like UC, organizations like Pew and PPIC to be playing more and more of. I also think just creating spaces where we can learn and listen to one another may help dampen some of the partisanship and, like, you know, just the noise that we hear where essentially people are often coming to the table, agreeing on the problem, often have alignment sometimes on a set of solutions, maybe not necessarily on how they're portrayed or like some of the marginal details. But the more you can create spaces so that you can at least try to find out where the areas of agreement are, I think would just be very valuable for the policymaking process generally.
Robin, as an economist in the trenches doing the research, what would help you get your evidence to people that need to hear it?
Yeah, no, I think that it's, that translation of research is really important. So I've heard it termed translational research, right? Where you are, you being in front of or participating in events like this where you have a mixture of policymakers, practitioners, and researchers who can come together and discuss the issues and kind of bring forth the knowledge that they each bring from the table, one from a more applied perspective, one from a perspective that has been able to really think about sort of over an extended period of time the issues and maybe focus narrowly on trying to understand or identify the cause of a particular problem, right? And then people who have their ear to the ground and who kind of hear and know what's going on in the community. And so you need all of those perspectives, I think, to create effective policy because, you want your policy to be informed by the evidence, but you also want to understand how the policy is translating and one thing we didn't, I don't think, talk about very much is implementation and how it's being implemented on the ground as well and whether something is working. And so I think that's where, research can shed light on what's working and in terms of in general, and then you can have a more practical view from practitioners that can see how specific policies are impacting their constituents or the people that they're serving as well. And then, of course, policymakers do the job of creating the policies and bringing it together to try and create legislation that will help to address specific issues, right? To improve the inner working of society. But yeah, I think all three are necessary, and we can't get good, effective legislation without all three of those components. And so really having avenues like this that help to bring these groups together are really useful and helpful.
Thank you, Robin. And I believe we're at time for Q&A. Is that right? Okay, good.
Okay, we're going to open up Q&A. We're going to start with a Zoom question.
All right, so first question from our Zoom attendees. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate California's ability to ensure all residents benefit from innovation, and what would you change to make innovation more equitable?
I mean, I think based on where we see if you take inequality and income inequality and wealth inequality, I'm not sure that all residents have benefited from the tech boom, right, that has happened here. But I would say better education, better access to better quality education would help with that, right? And helping to fund education. I know there's been some initiatives that have happened within California to provide greater access to education, but education, especially higher education and going to college, can be prohibitive. And there's research that suggests that, for example, marginalized groups don't necessarily, even from higher incomes, they're not able to, the benefit of being from a higher income family doesn't necessarily translate to the kids in terms of debt. And so just having greater access to education and more affordable education, especially for marginalized communities and better quality education, I would say would probably help to address that.
Well, I just pile in. I think I was clearly going to say 7. 7 out of 10 is the clear answer. Yeah, I think, yeah. But there's nothing more important. Still, after the decades go by, education is always the most important thing. And the more people get a quality education, the more you get to higher education. And the fact that one of the, talking about transitional things, right? The transition of the economy into this, everyone goes to college and then has a major debt, was a bad transition. We need to transition away from that. And we're making good progress on that. We're within a few $1 billion of being able to provide full debt-free college at UC and CSU to all lower and middle income students to almost middle high income students. So everybody can go to school and finish and not be held back with debt. And that makes it easier to go buy a home and get your roots here so you don't move out of the state, stay here, buy a home, build that generational wealth. So education and then is of course the key.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Provost?
This is what you have a chief academic officer for, is to generate these questions. But I wanted to make one point and then want to ask one question. And that is that this particular place, the UC Sacramento Center, should be your go-to place to discover where there are people with expertise that can be helpful. Any of the topics raised today probably have 25 people on the faculty, just like our colleague here, who have very valuable expertise to offer. And one of the things we're hoping to do as we move forward in building this center is to increase the density of those contacts between the legislative analysts and our researchers, and to have a better sense internally of what's on your mind that we can be preparing research for that will be helpful. So I think there's actually a lot to look forward to in creating and sustaining that brain trust, which is a goodly part of the reason for the University of California. But I also wanted to ask a question. If we think about, and you mentioned the CHIPS Act, if we think about the changes that have happened with respect to the federal government in the Biden administration, I think we can see that for the first time, perhaps since the Second World War, which is a long time, we have something that looks like industrial policy. And what industrial policy has done is link the massive investment possibilities of the federal government into vital areas of innovation that will make a difference for citizens, that will help to clean up our air, that will help to produce new sources of energy. The CHIPS Act, ARCHES, the hydrogen hub, ARPA-H, the sort of medical innovation centers, new energy initiatives. California is the 5th largest or 4th largest by some people's account economy in the world, should be capable of similar kinds of industrial policies. And I'm wondering what you see in the landscape out there. The federal government has taken the lead and has, I think, shown a masterful leadership role here. But what about in California? Can we imagine similar kinds of industrial policies that have the same sort of regional powerful impacts, especially in our lower income regions, the Inland Empire, San Joaquin Valley? We think that there's a lot that could be done along those lines. We'd be very interested in what you see as potential moonshots that could be California-led.
Well, we are a big economy, and but we have constraints that our federal friends don't have and things, and so we'd have to do more to harness more of our resources to then allocate them around to do things. But your point is right, and look, we're going to have some innovative ideas through some of the bond conversations and other things to get some of those things that you're getting at. And I know it's an issue of thinking about. We're going to be spending a lot of public money and a lot of the one-time funds that we spent during this big boom that's going out still. A lot of it is sort of climate driven, and it's about the green economy and doing those things and figuring out ways to make sure that the people that are getting the money and the private industry that's getting the money doing these good things, that they're also being good partners in that. And I think we'll probably hear more from the Senate on this in the coming weeks and months on that, because it's important. And when we do partner, we're able to get out there and help businesses grow and do their things, that they're good kind of corporate citizens and are doing the right things by their workers and their communities as well.
I guess I would very hesitantly add on, but I think in addition to Chris's point, in terms of the state's inability to deficit spend is a major constraint on its ability to do similar types of investment that come at the federal level to try to stimulate that type of industrial activity. That said, I think maybe I'd flip the question even onto our own office and our own work. We often get asked questions about kind of where's all the infrastructure money gone in California? Where is the CHIPS money gone? Where is the small business money that came in during the pandemic gone? And I think one of the challenges we face in trying to answer those questions is there's not always great centralized information about how the state has best leveraged those federal dollars to achieve a particular end. And it's challenging because it's decentralized and different companies are applying for different grants. And, you do want to rely on the private sector to optimize the utilization of those dollars. And so there's a push and pull from kind of a state-based approach versus a private sector-based approach. But it's a fair question, kind of how the state, I think how the state could best leverage those federal investments to achieve the priorities of the legislature and of the administration. And it's one I think in the last few years that has really been a bit vexing for our office in trying to best articulate for the legislature how could it pull down the resources it wants to achieve its goals. One of the areas where I think the state has had to date a fair amount of success in sort of establishing a vision for what to do has been in broadband expansion and using those federal dollars to do broadband expansion and also investing state dollars in broadband expansion. Still a long ways to go there and very complex planning and financing, but that is one of I think one of the success models where the state has done a good job in kind of one of those one-time federal investments.
Just living within the constraints of the state, because you can't deficit spend. It's not something that the state can do, whereas the federal government can do that very willingly. I would say that a moonshot could look like common sense permitting reform. If you think about an opportunity to continue to protect public health, protect the environment, while also allowing for sensible development to take place, that could be a real opportunity. Right now, when you think about the transaction costs of doing anything in California, they're quite high. They contribute to the bottom line of any project that you're trying to get penciled out. And as a result, that money is not necessarily going toward as productive of a use as it could be. So, with permitting reform, you could have the dollars go a little bit further. I know that sounds boring. Maybe you were thinking about be the leader in quantum computing. But, as someone who is thinking about what's feasible within the constraints that California currently has, that seems like an opportunity to really make sure that development can happen while also thinking about the public health and environmental protections that it still wants to keep front and center.
Thank you all so much. That's about all the time we have for questions. But Sarah, if you have any last closing remarks, otherwise we'll go ahead and take a short break.
I don't know. These are all tough issues. So I guess closing on continuing the collaboration and the conversation here at UC Sacramento. Yeah.